One of the really wonderful things that I get to do and have been able to do over these last many years is work with some of the very best and the very best and the very brightest and the people on the cutting edge of Second Amendment legal issues and scholarship. And one of those peoples those people is David Hardy. And I've been working with David for 25 plus years. And it is my very, very distinct pleasure to be able to have this book so that you can all have this book this year. This was probably the first book that really ever talked about the historiography of the Second Amendment, and it really was critical to the whole concept of the individual right becoming more discussed and more researched and more debated. So I would like to give the mic to Dave. Thank you.
Glad to be here. I was actually sort of a homecoming. I was born here in Phoenix, and my father was born in Yuma, and my grandfather was born in Cave Creek, just north of here, Cave Creek, Arizona territory. So I do go back a little ways. I also go back a little ways in the Second Amendment conflict, the individual versus the collective rights type view. I've been attending these conferences now, it's a little shocking to add it up, but 39 years. I spoke at the first one back in 76, was it? I think it was 76, back when they were called the Academics Conference. The reason they were called the Academics Conference was this was at the very gestation of the Second Amendment individual rights view. And so Second Amendment Foundation had the idea of a much smaller conference, maybe a couple of dozen people, getting together who'd published in the field or might be publishing in the field in the near future, and having them meet, talk, share their ideas. Really, the development of the Second Amendment up to the current day has gone through 4 stages, and I'll talk primarily about the first because the last 4th stage is really the subject of the rest of this conference. Back in the early days, and now we're talking 1970s, I brought out one of the first law review articles on the topic. I still have my copy, 1974. Back in those days, there were a number of us publishing on the Second Amendment. Joyce Malcolm, Steve Halbrook, myself, and there were a few others, David Kaplan, Bob Dowlett, and some others. We were publishing in the minor law reviews, and I'm talking Northern Kentucky, Chicago, Kent. We were doing the research, we were finding the critical facts and historical evidence, but we couldn't break into the big name reviews. But over about 12 years, really up to 1986, we laid out the evidence. In '86, the movement entered its second stage, which was when Don Cates managed to get an article in the Michigan Law Review summarizing all of the data that had been brought up. Now, within the legal academic hierarchy, Don was not a big name, but Michigan was a big name law review. The big names in constitutional law were not going to be reading Northern Kentucky or Chicago, Kent, but they would read Michigan. Generally, depending upon who does the rating, it's rated somewhere between number 6 and number 8 in the country. And then we started attending the Second Amendment conferences, as I say, back in '76. You should have seen it. Back then, Steve Halbrook and I were in our 20s. Don Cates, in his early 30s, was sort of the old man of the group. I mean, we were all a bunch of youngsters trying to start a movement. As a result of Don Cates' Michigan Law Review publication, though, the views that had been generated and the evidence that had been generated did come to the attention of the big names in American constitutional law. The first one of which was Sandy Levinson, professor of law at the University of Texas, very well respected, and like most of the people who would follow, very liberal generally. And he published his article entitled The Embarrassing Second Amendment, which was on the theme of how can we treat the Second Amendment in a way that we haven't treated all the other cases arising under the Bill of Rights. There's no ethically principled way we can be doing what we are doing. And he was swiftly followed by William Van Alstyne, then of Duke, now of William and Mary, Akhil Amar of Yale, the big name in 14th Amendment academics. Finally, even Larry Tribe of Harvard, way out on the left, in the second edition of his constitutional law treatise, finally had to admit that there was a lot of evidence for the Second Amendment as an individual right, although, as he put it, of uncertain dimensions. So at that point, we finally had the big names mustering behind a bunch of very small-time people who'd done the original research. And at that point, it moved into litigation. Now, you've got to understand that within the Second Amendment movement generally, there had been thoughts of litigation going back into the 1990s. At one point, there was a conference specifically designed along the lines of what are we looking for in the Second Amendment test case. And it was interesting because the group, it was called by then NRA President Bob Corbin. The group split down very nicely. All the litigators wanted to go for it, and all the academics were saying, no way, no way. Well, with one exception, who is present here today, Joe Olson, professor of law, and he was for going for it, provided we did some additional groundwork. Other than that, it split perfectly, and needless to say, nobody did anything. And then, after some years, along came an interesting group of people. Alan Gura, who you've heard and I believe will hear from today quite a bit. Bob Levy and Clark Neely, who did put together the test case. A small team of people, well-motivated, carefully planning on their own without major organizations having some grand battle plan. And that was the plan that finally came through. I can tell you, up through 2000, maybe 2005, I would never have believed that I would be standing here speaking to a conference, the whole subject of which revolved around where is the Second Amendment going in court. Because up to that point, the Second Amendment was going nowhere in court. And no one really had an idea of where to take it in court. And today we're looking at the fruit of all this work that has gone over for about 40 years that finally came down to the point when we can debate those topics and those tactics. You know, first time I spoke on this subject, it was North Carolina, not far from the site of the Battle of Kings Mountain, 1780, American Revolution. And I always thought there was a certain comparison to be drawn there. What happened at Kings Mountain was not George Washington with his plans or his strategy or anything else. In fact, it wasn't any one leader. What happened was that Major Ferguson of the British Army had supposed to sweep inland, get the over-the-mountain men to the British side, sent out an ultimatum that unless they swore allegiance to George III, they would be visited with fire and sword. Well, he didn't know the men he was dealing with. The over-the-mountain men didn't like that very well, and they didn't respond very well to that mode of persuasion. There was no grand plan. Nobody hatched an overall strategy or anything else. It's just that about 1,200 of them got hacked off, took their rifles and their horses, and went eastward looking for this Major Ferguson who thought he could talk to them like that. And as they went along, they didn't know anything about military arts. The total amount that they knew was that there was a unit called a company of roughly 100 or more men, and its commander was a captain. So as they coalesced coming down the roads toward Kings Mountain, when they got up to about 100 men, they elected a captain. I had an ancestor in Captain Severs' company. And eventually they caught up with Major Ferguson. and they went in with no organization higher than a captain. The battle plan was basically the captains put their heads together and decided to go up the hill. But at the end of the day, Major Ferguson's detachment had ceased to exist, and the western end of Cornwallis's offensive had just gone to pieces. Well, that's how it was in 1780. And I can tell you, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, that was how it was with the gun movement, the Second Amendment movement. There was no overall plan. There was no overall system of command. It was just a bunch of individuals, Joyce Malcolm, Steve Halbrook, later Alan Gura and company, all fighting on their own hook, all reaching the best plans that they could without any coordination. It was a mighty rugged way to do battle. On the other hand, we took the hill. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, this is the book. It's concise, it's informative, and please, everybody read it, and we'll try to make Dave's hand sore signing. Thank you very much.